Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Israeli government spokesman Eylon Levy. This is day 130 of the October 7th war. IDF fatalities since the start of the October 7th massacre have risen to 569. That's up by 3 since yesterday's update. The people of Israel grieve with the families of Lieutenant Colonel Reserves Netanel Yaakov El-Kubi, 36, Sergeant First Class Reserves Ziv Chen, 27, and Major Reserves Yair Cohen, 30. An update on the October 7th hostage crisis following the successful hostage rescue mission that brought home Fernando Marman and Luis Ha from Hamas captivity in Rafah. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with special forces. He praised the operation as one of the most successful rescue missions in the history of the State of Israel, end quote, and congratulated the counter-terror officers on their perfect execution. This operation was, of course, material evidence that Israel's strategy is working, and only military pressure will bring the hostages home. The government of Israel remains committed to securing the release of all the remaining 134 hostages through rescue missions in the heart of Hamas's last stronghold where possible, and by creating the conditions for another framework for the release of all the other hostages where not. The world must demand the immediate and unconditional release of the 134 hostages still trapped in Gaza, and if Hamas ignores that demand, it must stand by Israel's side as we fight to bring them all home now. An operational update: IDF efforts to dismantle Hamas in the wake of the October 7th massacre continue across the Gaza Strip. Just yesterday, we received a horrific reminder of the Hamas human shield strategy and Hamas's deliberate efforts to conduct attacks from among and under civilian areas. In western Khan Yunis, 2 terrorists attempted to move under the cover of Gazan civilians, and when one of them pulled out a pistol at an IDF vehicle, they were both eliminated by our forces. The IDF also took action against weapons storage facilities in terrorist homes in Khan Yunis, and we expect firm international condemnations of the Hamas human shield strategy, which has been responsible for so much suffering. Humanitarian update: yesterday, February 12th, 160 humanitarian aid trucks entered the Gaza Strip via Israel's Kerem Shalom crossing. 160 trucks. Additionally, 23 trucks were inspected at Nitzana and entered Gaza through the Rafah crossing. That means 7 times more humanitarian aid is entering Gaza through Israel than Egypt. Reports suggesting that Rafah is the main crossing for humanitarian aid, or even the only crossing, as I saw in the BBC, are simply in opposition to the dry facts. Any allegations that Israel is restricting the entry of aid to Gaza are similarly detached from reality, whether through ignorance or, dare I say, in some cases, malice. In total, since Hamas used the Gaza Strip as the base for the October 7 massacre, 235,000 tons of humanitarian aid have entered the territory aboard 12,775 trucks. All this data is available on Kogat's mini site. And we remind you, according to our intelligence estimates, Hamas is hijacking up to 60% of that aid, and video footage of Hamas gunmen on top of those trucks have been circulating widely. Those 235,000 tons include 155,560 tons of food, including the flour that allows Gaza's 15 industrial bakeries to produce 2 million loaves of bread, rolls and pita breads every single day. Those aid deliveries also include 21,460 tons of water, again since the start of the war, over 24,000 tons of shelter equipment, and nearly 17,000 tons of medical supplies. That's quite apart from the field hospitals whose construction in the Gaza Strip we have facilitated. Just in recent days, the IDF helped deliver over 20 oxygen tanks and other medical equipment to the Al Amal hospital in Khan Yunis, despite its abuse by terrorists as a military hideout. By all possible accounts, Israel is exceeding its obligations to facilitate the delivery of aid to the Gaza Strip. International donors that want to see more aid enter Gaza should simply send more. We're ready to facilitate it. They should also work urgently to replace UNRWA so that UN agencies that are not in cahoots with Hamas and covering up for Hamas can do a better job delivering the aid that is already entering the Gaza Strip. That's it for today's update. We'll now take your questions.
Question from Joel Pollack of Breitbart News. US Senator Chris Van Hollen accused Israel yesterday of a war crime for, as he alleged, deliberately withholding food from Palestinian children, food aid from Palestinian children. He also said last week that Israel is placing unnecessary obstacles in the way of aid and that Hamas is not stealing the aid. What is Israel's response?
The only people who are deliberately withholding food from civilians in Gaza is Hamas, which has been hijacking aid, and UNRWA, which has been covering up for Hamas's theft of aid, has been complicit with Hamas war criminals stealing that aid from civilians. As I just said in this briefing now, Israel has placed no restrictions, zero, on food, medicine, water or shelter equipment entering the Gaza Strip. We have excess capacity to more than double it, and 7 times as much humanitarian aid is entering via Israel as is entering from the Rafah crossing with Egypt. The problem is that the UN agencies on the ground, namely UNRWA, which has claimed a monopoly on distributing aid, is struggling to distribute that aid at the pace that Israel is facilitating its entry into Gaza. That is why the Kerem Shalom crossing is closed on Saturdays at the request of the United Nations, because there is so much piling up on the other side that they have not been able to distribute. Now, if you want to see humanitarian situations improve inside the Gaza Strip, we urge all countries, all donors to UNRWA, the same UNRWA whose main headquarters sat directly above the Hamas server farm that was leaching its electricity, and no international donors have asked to see the electricity bill for that, to the best of our knowledge. UNRWA should be replaced with the UN's agencies that have a tried and tested experience in disaster zones, doing emergency relief, that are not already riddled with Hamas and can do the job of delivering the aid that is already entering through Israel. And any allegations, again, that somehow Israel is restricting the delivery of aid into the Gaza Strip are simply contrary to the dry facts.
Can you say anything about Israel sending a delegation to Cairo or any progress towards a deal? That's a question from Gwen Ackerman.
Gwen, no updates about efforts that are constantly ongoing to secure the release of the hostages. I think the very brave and daring hostage rescue mission that brought back 2 of the hostages is a reminder that the IDF has an ability to operate in the heart of Hamas's last stronghold, a fact that will surely be on their minds, and we will work to release the hostages through daring rescue missions of the sort that Israel has been famous for, wherever possible, and where not, by continuing to apply military pressure to create the conditions to get all 134 home. We remain committed to that pledge that there will be no one left behind.
Hannah Julian of the Jewish Press asks, Minister Goldknof has ordered the closure of all UNRWA facilities in Israel. Will that order actually be carried out in Jerusalem?
I'm not familiar with the particular details, but if that is a legal decision by the government that has been made, an order that has been made, then I would expect so.
Question from Emily Rose of Reuters. Is there a plan to evacuate civilians from Gaza? Is there a response to the French sanctions on members of the settler community? And is there a response to Borrell's suggestion the US cut military aid?
Sorry, there was 3 questions. Just again, Kiwi, if I can jot them down.
First question, is there a plan to evacuate civilians from Gaza? Second question, is there a response to the French sanctions on members of the settler community? And third question, is there a response to Borrell's suggestion the US military cut aid?
Sure. As for questions of evacuation, since the beginning of this war, Israel has plainly surrendered the element of surprise and the military advantage that would have bestowed by giving warning for civilians to evacuate areas where terrorists are trying to use them as human shields. That is why, before the ground offensive, Israel made warnings for civilians to evacuate northern Gaza. And I can't remember off the top of my head the latest figures of whether it's 70,000 phone calls, however many million text messages, 15 million text messages, around 15 million recorded voice messages, millions of leaflets. It's fair to say Israel has made more warnings for civilians to evacuate than all armies in the history of warfare put together, and quite happy to have Reuters fact check us on that matter if we are wrong. We are keen to attack Hamas targets without Hamas terrorists using civilians as human shields. Hamas has only 2 strategies to try to survive this war, and they're both evil and sick and twisted. The first is to hold on to the hostages we fear are being tortured and starved and raped and executed in its terror dungeons and use them as leverage to survive the October 7th massacre and remain on its feet. And the other is to try to hide behind civilians, aggravate a humanitarian crisis in order to generate international sympathy that will force Israel to stop this war. So we want to see civilians get out of harm's way so that Hamas cannot use them as human shields. And that is why when the Prime Minister instructed the army to draw up a plan to dismantle the last 4 Hamas battalions in Gaza after the destruction of the 18 battalions north of Rafah, he also ordered it to come up with a plan for how civilians may be evacuated from Rafah, because we do not want to see them being hurt. As for the question about the French, I saw that this news broke just a few minutes before we go off air, went on air. I'm not familiar with any comment that has been made by government officials in that regard. I would refer you to a statement made by the Prime Minister after similar measures were made by the United States, in which he explained that, in his opinion, those are quite unnecessary and unhelpful. As for the third question about the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, unfortunately, there's never been a time in history when the world has supported the right of Jews to physically defend themselves from the threat of annihilation. None. The idea that Jews should be defenseless in the face of mass murderers who cremated whole families alive on October 7th recalls the darkest moments of European history. It's also a reminder of why a strong, sovereign, independent Jewish state is so important in the first place. The recent European Parliament resolution from just 3 weeks ago, reaffirming Israel's right to dismantle Hamas and bring the hostages home, in fact saying there should be no permanent ceasefire until Hamas is dismantled and the hostages are brought home, is an encouraging confirmation that Europe is not reverting to type. We think that people should have a long, hard think after the October 7th massacre about what side of history they want to be on, Hamas or the Jews.
As a follow-up question from Emily Rose of Reuters, question is, do you have any comment on David Cameron?
Anything specific about Lord Cameron? About if your question is about Lord Cameron's calls for a humanitarian pause, I must admit we are deeply confused about what the British position is. The idea of an urgent humanitarian pause to let aid in and hostages out is a magic bullet that does not exist. If it were that easy to get the hostages out through a temporary pause that would let more aid in, we would have done it ages ago. In fact, Hamas would not have violated the last hostage release pause that was intended to do exactly that. Hamas is not interested in a temporary pause that would let hostages out and let aid in. That option is not on the table. And so we are fighting in order to create the conditions that will force Hamas to release the hostages. Now, I've seen Lord Cameron and the British government also speaking about the need for a sustainable ceasefire. And I recall Lord Cameron's own column in The Times with the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, I think it was on the 17th of December, in which they explained that any sustainable ceasefire had to be predicated on Hamas laying down its arms and no longer being in power. They wrote, I think I have a copy of it somewhere here, that we do not believe that calling right now for a general and immediate ceasefire, hoping that it somehow becomes permanent, is the way forward. It ignores why Israel is forced to defend itself. Hamas barbarically attacked Israel and still fires rockets to kill Israeli citizens every day. Hamas must lay down its arms. In that column, they also speculate, let us imagine that we did press Israel to cease all military operations forthwith. Would Hamas stop firing rockets? Would it rescue the hostages? The answer is no, and they go on to say that any unsustainable ceasefire quickly collapsing into further violence would only make it harder to build the conditions necessary for peace. We too agree there should be a sustainable ceasefire after Hamas lays down its arms. It's called a total Israeli victory, and anything short of that, as Lord Cameron has correctly noted in the past, would only be a recipe for more violence and instability, because Hamas will not stop its genocidal war against our people, and showed us on October 7th the barbaric violence that it is happy to perpetrate unless it is stopped, and we will stop it.
Question from Hanan Lashinsky of All Israel News. Can you confirm reports that Israel is considering French proposals for Hezbollah to withdraw only 10 kilometres instead of all the way to the Litani? Does Israel connect between efforts at ceasefires in the northern and southern arenas? And does a truce in one arena influence the other one?
Sure. As for the question about the situation in Lebanon, we have been clear. UN Security Council Resolution 1701 must be enforced. It is the solution that is agreed by the government of Israel, the government of Lebanon, the United Nations as well. That architecture exists, and it's time to put it into place, even though Hezbollah has systematically violated it with its mere presence in southern Lebanon and the constant rocket fire that, as you know, has displaced over 80,000 Israelis who cannot return to their homes. Israel has been clear this situation in the north must end with a clear change. As long as Hezbollah is on our border with the possibility of perpetrating an October 7th style massacre on a much larger scale, we must treat it as October 6th, and northern Israel must be safe for citizens to return to their homes, free of the fear of being abducted into Lebanon, and free of the fear of the sort of rocket fire that Hezbollah has been unleashing on Israel since it decided to join this war on Hamas's side on October 7th. Hezbollah at the moment appears hell-bent on dragging Lebanon into a totally unnecessary war, a war that will have disastrous consequences for Lebanon if Israel is forced to defend its people in a full-scale war, given what we know about Hezbollah's military arsenal. There is a diplomatic window. We hope that it is still possible to reach diplomatic solution in that window that will make it safe for Israelis to return to their homes in northern Israel. But the current situation is intolerable, and our position is clear. Either Hezbollah backs away, or we will have to push it away ourselves.
A follow-up question from Hannah Julian of the Jewish Press. Any update on the decision by the government to close Al Jazeera media facilities in Israel?
I'm not familiar with that. Not familiar with that report. We'd have to circle back to you on that. Although I hope, in that context, that you have, of course, seen the intelligence that was declassified by the IDF about the so-called Hamas journalist who was, in fact, a paid member of the Hamas military wing. A reminder that not everyone calling themselves journalists in Gaza are, in fact, real journalists. Many of them are simply Hamas content creators, and others are simply using that press vest as a way, again, to blend into the civilian population, make it difficult for Israel to exercise the principle of distinction and target Hamas, and of course, therefore, to generate international sympathy by manipulating the world's emotions.
Chloe Bazir from AFP asks, any comment on Hind Rajab death in northern Gaza Strip?
I've seen those reports. They are deeply upsetting. I'm not familiar with any particular details about it. I believe the IDF is investigating. Needless to say, the IDF does not target civilians. We are targeting Hamas. We think it is tragic and heartbreaking that everyone who has been killed since October 7th would still be alive if Hamas had not launched this war and decided to wage this war from inside and under urban areas. And no one else need be hurt if Hamas do what the whole world should be demanding that it do, which is to surrender, lay down its arms, release the hostages, and turn over its war criminals for a tribunal. And until then, we will continue taking necessary and proportionate action to dismantle the Hamas military machine in pursuit of that legitimate military objective of dismantling the army of terror that perpetrated the atrocities of October 7th.
Joel Pollack from Breitbart News asks, were Javier Milei's prayers answered with the release of the Argentinian Israeli hostages? Joel Pollack asked, were Javier Milei's prayers answered with the release of the Argentinian Israeli hostages? Argentinian Israeli hostages. Were Javier Milei's prayers answered with the release of the Argentinian Israeli hostages?
Were President Milei's prayers answered with the release of the hostages? I think the whole of Israel, the whole Jewish world, woke up to a lot of prayers that had been answered with the release the successful rescue mission of those two hostages, and whether prayers work, I couldn't comment, but we certainly welcome everyone who wants to keep the hostages in their thoughts and continue raising awareness about the plight of those hostages who were ripped away from their families 130 days ago and have been literally rotting underground, buried alive. Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much, everyone, and do keep safe.